Finally, this movie has graced our screens, and finally, I got a chance to see it. Spider-Man Homecoming was easily one of my most anticipated movies of the year, and nothing was going to stop me from seeing it as soon as I possibly could. I just couldn't wait to see one of my favorite characters and childhood hero up there once again on the big screen. And though he's had his fair share of screen time over the last few years, with a few different incarnations already, well, shut up. I was still really excited to see it. Get off my back. But with all that being said, was this film ultimately worth the wait? Was this the greatest Spider-Man movie ever made? Well, you know what? I'm still undecided on where it ranked compared to the others, but at this very moment, I am very confident in saying that either way, I loved this movie. I'm Jack Fitzpatrick, and this is my review of Spider-Man Homecoming. So from the get-go, Spider-Man Homecoming drops us right in with Peter Parker and brilliantly presents us with his double life between both the classic and monotonous events of being a high school student, and of course some of the sprawling epic chapters of being his super-heroic alter ego. And from there, I was basically sold. The movie opens with a sort of behind-the-scenes moments of the events before and just after Spider-Man's moment in Civil War. But then after that, rather than Peter's life being totally changed and fighting supervillains with the Avengers every day, he instead is then dropped back into his normal life, waiting on a call to get back on with Tony Stark. And already from here we get a real sense of what kind of a film this is trying to be. Basically what I just described before, somewhere halfway between a high school comedy and a super-powered blockbuster. As Peter struggles between his commitments, with him the plot rolls along with refreshing rhythm. There is something to Homecoming that makes his film feel so lively and swift, and I think what really assists us into feeling like something new is the overall structure, because it didn't feel like it was overly restrictive. It didn't feel like the writers behind it were sitting in a room saying, alright, by the 30-minute mark, Spider-Man needs to be here, and then here there needs to be some sort of explosion, or else the audience will just get bored. Rather than some generic and thrown together storyline, the film instead ducks and weaves from the conventional. The somewhat unique approach sort of kept me on my toes. I wasn't entirely sure what to expect at all times. I wouldn't go as far to say that it's like very unpredictable and that the movie shocked me in terms of originality, but there was a clear effort here to give us something new. And there were definitely enough surprises along the way, despite the rather extreme dose of advertising before the release of the film. Speaking of heavy advertising, I also just have to say that this didn't at all feel like it was pulling an Amazing Spider-Man 2 trick of any sort. Some superhero films, and in particular ones produced by Sony, have often been criticized for not being their own movie, but simply rather exist just to usher audiences into the next film. But Homecoming was different, but funnily enough, not in the way that you might expect, because though I say it didn't feel like what I just described, there was still a lot of interconnectivity. There were obviously lots of moving parts going on behind the scenes within the MCU in the film. But it never felt cheap. They weren't trying to sell us on this, but rather naturally develop these things. It felt patient while also showing us that these sorts of things are being thought of. It also felt heavily set in this established universe. Tony Stark is obviously present, references to previous films are here too, and it's things like this that really make these Marvel films, and in particular Homecoming, feel unified. Homecoming expands this world just that little bit more. That being said though, I wouldn't exactly say that it expanded things to an outrageous extent. Homecoming didn't really change the game or affect things heavily. It wasn't an essential chapter in the MCU. Rather, Homecoming chooses to be on a relatively smaller scale. It wasn't aiming to be the next Avengers or some big 4-hour epic. More so, it was kind of more just about Peter Parker getting by as a normal kid and as Spider-Man. It was about the little things, the in-between moments. It was about getting to Homecoming as much as it was about fighting crime. It was about being on the decathlon team and the students involved as much as it was about battling the Vulture. I think that it allows it to be possibly the most fun Spider-Man movie yet. Without the self-importance and the angst, Homecoming is just fun. Another thing that was also just more straight up fun was the character himself. Peter Parker felt like a real kid. He's nervous around the girl he likes, he's goofy and clumsy, and he has this intense enthusiasm and energy. It's things like this that really make this version of the character all the more believable, and Tom Holland does a phenomenal job portraying this kid who is often in over his head, all the while being extremely likable and entertaining. He also depicts this version of the character in a very genuine way. Peter is clearly a good person with only the best intentions. Although he still makes mistakes and is not perfect, he's still clearly learning, he's still growing up. And Holland just nails it. In fact, he's so good that, believe it or not, I think he may just be the best cinematic Spider-Man yet. Look, I love Tobey Maguire's version. He's like my childhood, and I even like Andrew Garfield quite a lot, despite clearly being the weakest of the three. But I think Tom Holland just may edge out on top for me. I don't know if this is exactly my favorite Spider-Man movie, but I do think that Tom Holland is my favorite Spider-Man. Speaking of the character so extensively though, let's talk about his good looks. looks, in which I mean the Spider-Man suit, because I wasn't a fan of the suit when it was first revealed around Civil War times. I thought that the eyes were too small, and I didn't entirely like how thin and concealed the webbing on the costume appeared. But you know what? I've grown to appreciate the different design. It keeps to the basics visually, while being different enough from the others to be its own thing. He also mostly looked pretty great in action too. He moved around sort of inhumanly, you know, like a Spider-Man, flipping and doing all sorts of ridiculous acrobatics and that sort of stuff along the way. But this is where I would also say that my first complaint lies. At times throughout the action sequences, he looked sort of rubbery. The CGI was just a little bit too obvious for my liking for just a little bit of the time. In a way, it kept reminding me of that one scene from whichever Blade movie it is. You know the one, maybe, unless you don't. But anyway, it was nowhere near as bad as anything like that. I'm still very happy with the action and the CGI and whatnot, but it did mildly dip from time to time, and Spider-Man himself just looked a tiny bit fake sometimes. Speaking of the action scenes though, I just have to talk about the fantastic scenery during them. Homecoming was shot well, and it really puts you into that over-the-top world too. We go along with Spider-Man as he dodges and fights, swings and climbs. I also appreciate that the film seemed to be purposefully avoiding what we've seen before, and kept trying to give us new obstacles for Spider-Man to endure. At one point he races through a suburban neighborhood, Ferris Bueller style, and at another he's on the Washington Monument. Another he fights on the beach. It's not all Empire State Buildings, Times Square and skyscrapers here. Alright, it's time to talk about one of the other essentials when it comes to a superhero movie, the villain. Michael Keaton's Vulture was a real bad guy, but in the best possible way. He's just like a slimy crook, but at the same time, he's actually quite understandable. Vulture felt like a much more realistic criminal in terms of the supervillains that Spider-Man has previously faced in film. Rather than just being a silly substandard supervillain with some sort of opposing power, this was a man with purpose, with real goals. Selfish though they may be, his motivations and thus actions make sense. He doesn't just want to burn the world ablaze, he still has a believable cause. But that being said, it's still not quite perfection just yet. From what we did see of the Vulture, it was great, but one of my issues with this movie was that he probably could have used a little more screen time. He wasn't around as much as I probably would have liked and expected. It left him feeling just a tad underdeveloped. But the ruthlessness of the character and of course the performance behind it brought out a truly memorable villain. As you probably know, Tony Stark was also in this movie, and after being heavily featured throughout the trailers and the poster, many were feeling kind of weary about his role. How big would it be? Too big? Many commenting that this movie looked more like Iron Man 3.5 rather than Spider-Man. But let me tell you, I'd say that he's actually in it like a perfect amount. Rather than being a major player in the film, he played along as sort of a side mentor, weaving in and out of the story and never taking center stage. His influence was definitely felt, and there was a lot of talk about him too, but this was far from Tony Stark's film. However, on an interesting note, the character also felt slightly more evolved since last time we saw him. It's clear that Tony Stark has majorly developed since the first Iron Man, and although he still has that sort of smartass and immature kind of feel to him, Stark is clearly a little more responsible, and just the fact that he plays the sort of overly protective dad in this film proves it. His presence throughout and this theme also brought quite an interesting conflict to the film, and like Civil War, made me question whose side I was on. Is Spider-Man ready to take on the big and the bad, or should he take it easy? Is it too dangerous for somebody his age, as powerful as he is? Much of this film was based around whether or not Peter is ready to take on the Spider-Man role, or if he's still just a kid, and Stark's presence only accelerated that theme. His influence in terms of Iron Man gadgets was also heavily involved too, which some people may take issue with, but you know what, I just thought it was really cool. In like a silly 12-year-old kind of way, I was loving all of the gadgets and the tech and all that. I thought they were really inventive. So yeah, anyway, Spider-Man Homecoming was pretty much exactly what I could have ever hoped. It was just a little more small scale, which suits the character well at this point in time. It was very comedic, which I always appreciate. It had a bit of a different tone and was going for something a little more alternative. And it of course heavily contained my favorite superhero within. So basically, I was left extremely satisfied. Homecoming also had great focus in terms of the creators behind it all. I think there was definitely an understanding of what sort of character they wanted to portray, and it all came together perfectly. John Watts also seems like a very promising director. I don't exactly understand where he came from, because his last few cinematic efforts don't exactly scream Spider-Man material. But that being said, I'm glad he was chosen, because I felt like you actually got a sense of his vision, and I think he did a remarkable job. Tom Holland was also probably the best Spider-Man that we could have asked for. He's ridiculously likable, and Michael Keaton was a great villain too, though slightly underdeveloped. The action scenes were for the most part very fun, very impressive, and were even obviously going for something fairly new. The film was also sort of light and casual, which makes perfect for a rewatch, and is perfect for Spider-Man too. Homecoming shines brightest when it seems to just be having fun. I love this movie, and I'm so happy that it turned out this way. Alright, so I'm about to do something. I'm about to rate this movie, and I feel funny about it, because I would rate Spider-Man Homecoming a 10 out of 10. Which feels like a lie because I know there's flaws. I know upon rewatch I'll probably notice more too, and I know that a 10 out of 10 should probably exclusively be reserved for your Logans and your La La Lands, but you know what? I'm letting my bias get ahead of me this time, and that's fine, because I admitted it. Spider-Man Homecoming gets a 10 out of 10, because I honestly feel like giving it any less would also be a lie. I couldn't have asked for more.